For today's episode of the podcast, I have the opportunity to talk to John Whitlock and Bruce Maxey, who are both principals and higher education design experts at BLDD Architects, a leading architecture firm passionate about the power of design to change the world. Specifically, BLDD does the majority of their work in higher education, senior living, K-12, and religious spaces. In our conversation today, we want to explore the topic of community college. John and Bruce, it's an honor to have you both here today. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, so this is great. I usually want to start with just getting some background information from you guys. So just really how'd you get started in architecture and how'd you end up where you are today?
I'll go ahead. So again, John Whitlock. I wish I had a really great story for how I got into architecture, but I went to college and didn't know what I wanted to do. I thought, well, you're good in math, you're good in science, so maybe you should be an engineer. What that didn't address was sort of my ADHD tendencies. That basically means I really like detail. I really like working with my hands. And so as an engineering student, I wasn't that great. I have an uncle who's still an architect, still does practice a bit. And I decided I'd just jump over to architecture. I didn't even talk to him about it. He was a little taken aback when I let him know that I had done that. But the opportunity to sort of work with my hands, back then we actually drew with pencils and T-squares and triangles. And so I really just took to it. I loved everything about it. The building of models, that working with my hands really, really helped. I also knew that I wanted to be somehow impactful in the world, somehow have some sort of impact on something, somebody, just an internal desire to do that. And I didn't really understand how architecture could do that. But when I started at BLDD in 1994, obviously they did a lot of education at the time. And so either higher ed or K through 12. So I got to work on a lot of different educational projects. And what you started to see is that the work that we were doing could positively affect a community, whether it be through students and staff utilizing a building or a community that now has a building that will stand for generations and really affect positively the things that go on in that community. So again, I was really lucky. I stumbled into architecture, but I've been extremely passionate about it ever since.
Great.
All right. My story, I guess, is I'll just jump to the end. So I've been here 32 years or approaching 32 years. When growing up, I always wanted to put things together, clubhouses, whatever it may be, using scraps of wood to build something. In my small high school, there was offered a drafting class. I was the only one who wanted to learn how to draft. Everybody else wanted to go out in the shop and fool around, but I forced them to draft at least part of the class. I had to learn something. And then getting out of college, I was fortunate that I had worked here at BLDD as a summer intern, and was fortunate at that time with the economy the way it was, that one of the local school districts passed a referendum. They're like, the referendum passed, we can hire you. So, and we've been doing schools ever since. And somehow I went even more so than John on the engineering side. I was schooled to be a structural designer. Okay. So my first 5 to 10 years I spent doing structural design, and slowly moved into project management, and eventually a principal, and now a CFO. So it's kind of a strange path, I think, but here I am.
Interesting.
So, and a community college expert.
That's where a lot of my planning time has been spent.
Okay. Wow. So you guys have both of your careers all been with BLDD?
Yeah, unusually so. Yes, we've been together. I guess I started in 94, so that's almost 30 years together.
30 years together.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
You never thought I would last that long. I promise you.
We try not to think about that.
Interesting. Well, that's great. You don't hear that too often now. Somebody spending 30 years at one firm. We had a woman retire a few years ago. She had been here for 32 years.
Our goal has always been to hire people for their career.
Oh, wow.
and we do a fairly decent job of it. But
we are definitely unusual that way, and I think a lot of it has to do with the type of work that we get to do. The type of work that I was talking about, impactful. We put a lot of responsibility on people, so they get to have really good insight and input into a design. So I just think it's a great place to work, and I think it's great people to work for. Really, that's what. We didn't take that as a joke, but it's supposed to be a joke.
We've never been one to hire a lot of people to meet a high demand and then let people go.
Gotcha.
So we'd rather everybody work a little harder to meet the high demand, but then those people can survive when the demand's not there.
No, that makes sense. I get that. Well, that's great. Well, going back to what you're saying, how about having like impact on projects and people, community. I just wanted to start off with, we talked about maybe focusing community colleges, but really looking at, higher education in general, like talking about trends that you guys are seeing, both in architecture and design.
Absolutely. I'll start big picture, and then Bruce has got a lot of good stories that can sort of into the specifics. And I guess what I would start with is what I find interesting is that everybody, contrary to popular opinion, students today aren't much different than they've always been. They aren't really out there. They aren't really difficult to deal with. But what they do have is options, right? And they have information at their fingertips. And so how do you attract those students? How do you create environments that attract those students? How do you engage them? And because they have so many options, we sort of refer to that in the building community as flexibility. Flexibility through furniture, flexibility through convertible spaces that gives them the ability to, when they want to, which is a lot of the time, sit around in a big group by themselves. Kind of an interesting concept where they're in this big group in this big room, but they got earbuds in and they got their phone on, and so they're working alone, to the fact that they can maybe work one-on-one in a small group or in larger groups, and giving them the ability to affect their environment themselves, again through furniture, through convertible rooms. And Bruce has lots of good examples of that too.
Right. So I think otherwise, right? So now everybody was thrown a curveball with learning online, right?
Sure.
Everybody had a little taste of it in work life and education life. Now people have kind of gone through the fun of, I can do this all from home. And now people have started to realize the issues with that, right? Well, I kind of like to see people once in a while.
Even the introverts.
Even the introvert. And I can't, and there are just some things that have a tactile requirement, right? You have to be able to touch them. And sometimes it's active learning or maker spaces. Healthcare, education has boomed. The shortage of healthcare. So all the community colleges are trying to meet that need, and a lot of the private colleges too. And then, as John said, flexibility, the ability, students want to be in their living room, but they also want to be with their friends and their classmates all at the same time. So you need to have some sort of flexibility. You can't put them in the chair from the tablet armchair from 1950. They're not going to stay around for that. So flexible furniture, comfortable furniture, a variety of different ways to attend a class. Those kinds of things are what they're looking for.
I think it's also interesting that, what happened within the higher education market is there was an arms race, creating all these large, beautiful spaces. And what they found for the most part is they were all empty. And that became a real problem, because you don't build these things without the idea of students being in them, because again, they have all of these options. And if you create every building that has all of these options, then where do they actually go? And we talk about a student's journey through their day, and where are they going? How are they accessing? What opportunities do you give them along that path, along that journey? And so I think wellness, student services, those are all things that, as you're going to, we did a facility at a private college where, the food service, to get there, you had to go through the library. Now that seems kind of odd, but at the same time, what that showed them is that there are things going on at the library that I wasn't aware of. It's not just a place for books. There's a place where studying is going on, where there's community going on. And along that path to get to the eating area, there were student services, student tutoring, wellness areas. Again, showing them that there are things available to them that they weren't necessarily aware of when they sat in the room on their phone with their earbuds on. And so creating this journey through their day is something that is really valuable to them.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I think it's interesting, and kind of what you started with too, is that, you know, students really haven't changed that much. Like we've been doing this talk for about 7 years, design for human behavior. And that's like the first thing we talk about is like people's behavior really doesn't change that dramatically over time. Like I've got to pick two pictures 10 years apart, and it's like, look, they both sit in the same place. They both sit and do the same thing. They both bring the backpack, put it in the same spot. And I think it's been, you know, I think you're right. Like COVID had this bit of an upset, but we all kind of like still regress back to the middle a little bit. And yeah, it's kind of interesting to hear you kind of like focus in on that, because I think that's where a lot of people get confused and overwhelmed when they're thinking about a new project or something.
Well, we know that trends are showing that there are less students. So people are fighting over less students. And so I forgot where I was going with that.
But I think it's important. I think you're right about the options. Like it's a higher competition. I mean, so we end up in a lot of library spaces, but there's like, when you go to a campus, what are the three places you visit? You visit the dorm, the library, and like the student center. So if
and actually, I think your major is like down to like 8 or 9 in terms of when you select a facility. Is that your major really doesn't have a huge priority. Student services, recreation facilities, sports, those things have a huge impact. So it's all about getting students, getting them in the door, and getting them to stay. We talk about student recruitment, but retention is just as big a part.
Yeah, no, that's very true. So, looking at, college university as like a whole bucket, like I said, we want to just kind of dive a little deeper into community college. Like, what would you say that difference is? What makes up that difference between like maybe a university and that community college? Like, what are you seeing there, architecture design wise?
Well, I think one thing you have to realize, community colleges need to be all things to all people. They have traditional students who maybe either didn't have the funding or know what they wanted to study to justify going to a 4-year college. They have adults who are retraining. They bring in other people of the community just to have a one night and evening class in history or economics or art or whatever it may be.
Cooking, dance,
all those things. So they are trying to. So they have probably the least in amount of funding, and they're trying to serve the widest variety of students. So everything has to be somewhat efficient for them to be able to do that. And they really do rely on flexibility. So they're competing with the 4-year institutions. If you go to a 4-year institution, it's pretty easy to get wowed by the rec center or this. But people have to weigh that against the benefits of either saving money, being local, and still getting the quality education and still having the quality facilities. I think one thing we found in our area is a lot of the high schools have recently undergone significant renovation work and updating, from the 50s or 20s when they were originally built. So now the community colleges, they have to keep up with the Joneses, right? Students will not accept going backwards to go to a higher education, so they will go elsewhere. So to compete, they have to upgrade their facilities equal to what the high schools are and to be competitive with the 4-year institutions.
Interesting.
See what else? Transient nature of students. I think one of the things that community colleges were really kind of originally lacking, at least around here, was they didn't have a lot of services for students. They didn't have a lot of amenities for students. People went to their 1 or 2 classes and went home, or went to a fast food place to get lunch or whatever. And community colleges have realized that there's a benefit both to the student and to them to keep them on campus. So they have to provide some of those amenities and some of those types of spaces to do that. if the students are there on campus, they are more engaged. They're more engaged with their classmates.
Yeah.
And if they can make sure that they're more engaged, then the likelihood of retention is that much better.
Yeah.
So those are some of the things John mentioned. It's the number of services they have to provide, whether it's tutoring or job placement. A lot are providing mental health services now, and even food pantries for students that are financially challenged. So there's trying to make it available for everyone is their key. Yeah.
Yeah, we've kind of seen a similar, in the furniture world, like where on our side, where the community college library is actually closer to like almost a public library type setup, because you're saying you're just meeting such a wide breadth of demographics between age and place in life and need. And, it definitely seems more complicated, and it seems more challenging too, because I've always joked that like, well, the higher education library folks, they've got it kind of easy. They usually get a nice big building. You can do a lot of stuff in it. The public library, people get the shaft because they get a tiny space and they got to serve like 10 times as many different people. How do you like approach that in the architecture and design to try to like meet that wide breadth of what the space needs to have, keep it flexible and long, and like kind of, future-proof it to some degree as best you can? I don't know. It's tough.
Well, I think future-proofing is always tough. Again, provide for flexibility, for accessibility, if knowing that they will come and change something. A simple example is when you put a storage closet in, chances are, if it's big enough, it'll be somebody's office someday. Yeah. So you go ahead and put a data jack in there and the fire alarm strobe. Just that way you don't have to do it, in 5 years when they decide, or 2 years, or 1 year when they decide they need the office for the next, support, somebody providing support for the students.
There's no doubt that the higher education library is probably one of the most underutilized spaces on campus. We do have some examples of what we've tried to do to improve on that. And it can no longer be a museum for books, right? Yeah. And so it also really helps when you have a librarian team that's on board with understanding that the whole goal is to get people inside these doors and taking advantage of the services that they provide. Yeah. And it can't just be, I need to go study and look at this reference book, because that reference book is available to them wherever they go. It is not just that anymore. And, and you see some of the easy solutions, typical solutions are, STEM areas, makerspace areas that allow for, creative, active learning. But it's also a place where there's food, where there's student services. You have to create a place that people have things that they need. And that's a great place for the library. And I talked about a project where we added food service to the library as an annex to that library. And there was a lot of pushback from the librarians, and it had more to do with odors and smells and things like that. But what we did was, as a part of a major artery for the college, for pathways for the students, is that they had to go through the library to get to that. And I mentioned that earlier, get to the cafeteria area, the dining area. And really what that did is it brought life to the library. It gave them a place to hang out before and after they ate. And again, access to services. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, you basically took it from a destination spot. People only went there to go to the library. Yeah. And now it has become kind of a cafe or a spot along, on Main Street where people are walking by to go somewhere else and stop in.
Right. Exactly. It's almost like a mall effect.
Yeah, no, I think you're right on that. Like the key thing is the services. And then I think people forget about that. It's not just like, you're right. If the building was just a repository of books, what are we doing? It's got to be, what is that whole package that it's providing, whether to the community or the students in there? I think that services component is really critical.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So just staying on the line of trends here, you guys talked a lot about flexibility. And again, I was just at a conference, the core conference, a couple of weeks ago, and that was, it's interesting that flexibility has always been always been a part of higher ed, but it seems like post-pandemic, that has really like amped up. I feel like more. I'm hearing that more and more and more. And I don't know if that's a reaction to like, well, I guess the whole world can just go to crap all of a sudden. We got to somehow to deal with it. Or was that a trend that was already on the upswing and then COVID just really shot it up? I mean, what have you guys been noticing?
Well, there's a dirty word in architecture called multi-purpose rooms. And so we had to get away from that. A room that was built for a lot of things and doesn't do any of them well.
Yeah.
So flexibility has to be different than that. And flexibility is really about, again, those options. And it can be handled through furniture. It can be handled through convertibility, where a room can open up into another room or into 4 rooms. Access to easy whiteboard locations, whether it's on the walls that are actually movable or the walls that are there, technology, Wi-Fi, all of those things are very important. And the thing about flexibility that became so important is the fact that when you build a space, it can't be dedicated to one thing that's not utilized all of the time. And so there's just too much cost associated with that for a university. And so providing a space that gives them the ability to use it many different ways and many different scenarios is really beneficial to the university or college.
What you said is you need to look a lot at the utilization of the space. How often is it utilized? How full is it when it is utilized? And try to right size the spaces. So instead of going in with 10, 24 student classrooms that are all the same size and all look the same, you go in with maybe 4 12-person classrooms and another handful of 24-person classrooms, and then a few maybe 36-person classrooms, so that they have the ability to right size the room for the class that's in there. And
it's a big deal because, especially on private college campuses, the registrar is going to tell you that, well, I don't have enough classrooms. And that's not really what they mean. What they don't have is the right size of classrooms. And there is obviously a trend, and it's an economic reason is, they need bigger classrooms. A lot of private colleges, focused on small class sizes. But the reality is that for English 101, a 75-person classroom isn't a terrible thing. And so but the problem is they don't have those. And so how do you make those available to them so that they can then have that flexibility, but also eliminating underutilized spaces?
So do you guys, do a process of like understanding? I mean, I know when we engage with somebody, or at least when I'm working with people or the team's working with people, we always kind of start like, don't tell me the furniture you need. Tell me what you're trying to do first. So like, do you guys what is your, and that's and then I also tell the team like until you ask why 7, 8, 10 times, like you don't really know the answer or what they're looking for. But like, what is your guys' process? Because I think it's real key to, you're really hitting on some good insights here, but how do you kind of work that in and work with a client to like really understand you do need the 75-person lecture hall, or you need the lecture hall that can turn into a 75-person room, but then go down? Like, how do you go about gain that insight?
I think you're exactly right. Is we have to gain their trust so that they'll let us solve their problem instead of giving us their solution. Right? We need to understand the problem. So spending time with them to figure out what that is, and with all the different stakeholder groups. That's the other fun thing about higher ed, right? There's no one person. There's almost an endless line of people to talk to about it.
Multiple committees.
Yes. So that's the key. And there's different ways we've gone about it. We try to customize it depending upon what the project is and who the client is and what they're looking for. Some clients really the administration likes to have more control over what's going on. And occasionally you will get the client that is just like, we know we need a reboot. What should we do? Yeah. Those are the ones, those are great, because then you can design the process to learn about what the issues are. And then you get to design the solution too. I was going to say that was probably the best story to share from Richland is they had the current campus was built in the 80s. It was built to be very efficient. It had a whole lot of the same size classrooms and very small corridors, double loaded corridors, classrooms on either side, corridor down the middle. Always made me think of in the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory movie, there's the long corridor where everybody walks and they get smaller and the perspective's all skewed. That's what it looked like. You could walk halfway down it and feel like you made it nowhere because it still seemed as far to the other end. So they knew they needed something different, but what was that? They had no idea what they needed. They just needed to be different. So we went through a design thinking process with them where we were able to meet with them to empathize with the users, a whole myriad of users, be able to kind of define what the problems were, and then worked actually with them, with the students and faculty, to ideate solutions. And then we were able to actually prototype them in underutilized space and test them out and tweak them, and so that those results were actually used in the final design. The empathy, the key point, the one interesting story out of that, well, I don't want to say one of the interesting stories out of that was we actually bribed the students to come answer questions. We had 6 questions. We were right outside the main food service area. You'll get free French fries. We'll give you a certificate for French fries if you come talk to us and answer these questions. So to try to generate some input.
Yeah, it worked on me.
It worked. Absolutely. Free food anytime. So one of the questions was, if you were king or queen for a day, what would you do? How would you change Richland? And one response was, I would put a zip line in to go between classes. And at that point, I'm sure I rolled my eyes. And why can't anybody take this seriously? We're trying to help.
Oh, but they were serious.
Once you start to unpack it a little bit and understand why, his problem was the corridors were narrow. Students would sit in the corridors between classes with their book bags, and he had to run a gauntlet to go from class to class. And it was a pain, and it annoyed him. And he wanted a quicker, easier way to do that.
Yeah.
So the solution isn't a zip line, because nobody would pay for insurance for that, right? But the solution was, why don't we give them somewhere to sit that's not in the corridor and develop furniture solutions to allow them to somewhere to go. Yeah. And it has transformed their campus once we were able to implement it. The students love it. They fill those spaces. They stay on campus now. It has really been a change for that, so much so that we've been able to do one additional renovation of existing space that has incorporated more of those type spaces. And we're getting ready to start on a third renovation of some of their existing space, which will include the library in this instance, to try to figure out how to reimagine that into what it should be, not only today, but for the next 20 plus years.
Okay, interesting. There's an interesting part that I wanted to pick on there too, is where you said prototype a space. And I think that's really key. And I usually really press people, because again, my background is product development. So I'm like, my whole life is failing my way to success. And I think people don't put enough emphasis on that. It's like, it's because it's one, like, okay, we're going to do this whole space. Like, we're going to guess it all perfectly the first time. It's like, when has that ever happened? I think that's one benefit of being the flexibility, because now you have the ability to change. But I think prototyping that space, like, how often do you get to do that with customers? Is that something that happens frequently? Because I'm always pushing for it. I think it's a space, money, time challenge. People seem to be always pressed for time. And I'd say, well, why rush something? Because you're going to be stuck with the problem for the next 30 years. Do you get that opportunity often to do that prototyping with clients?
I would not necessarily say often. It's happened. We've been able to do that several times at both higher ed and K-12 level.
Okay. Yeah.
It has been everything from setting up very simple mock partitions in a warehouse, to what we were able to do at Richland is they had a third of the corridor in question was underutilized, and they were able to rearrange their class schedule to empty that. And we, both staff from BLDD as well as their maintenance staff, went in and basically started cutting holes in walls and rearranging things and opening it up. One of the key things we did was we actually opened up that corridor space to allow some of the natural light from the outside windows to penetrate to where the students would hang out. Go figure that they wanted daylight.
Right.
So yeah. And then we were able to, quite honestly, go and beg furniture manufacturers to provide some samples of furniture to put in those spaces. And then we could try different combinations and different size spaces and see how they would see how the staff or the faculty and the students rated it. We allowed them to use it for the summer semester that way. We made some revisions during the summer semester and then got feedback through surveys and such and testimonials on what worked and what didn't work. They even continued to use some of those spaces during the fall semester while we were then working on the design until the actual project started.
And Joe, you said it. I think, unfortunately, we haven't implemented it as much as we probably should or convince people to do it. But it doesn't matter what you're spending. If it's $200,000 and that's what you've got, or 20 million, you'd like to know that it's going to work. Right. And it's not just somebody's idea that's obviously maybe well thought out and worked through with the staff and students of that facility, but you just never know until you build it. And the worst thing that can happen, and we talked about it earlier, is all these large monuments at these universities where there's nobody there. And so that's just a waste of money.
I think the other, kind of alluding to what you said there, the other thing that happens is hopefully we're designing more modern spaces that are not the traditional teacher in front, blackboard on the wall, use the transparency projector, although some teachers still want that. So these spaces are new, and it's a new tool for them to use. And it's not, they don't know how to use it day one out of the box. The faculty needs to be educated, and it takes time to learn how to use it. I guess the analogy I use is, if somebody's only ever had a hammer to put a nail in, and you give them a drill and a screw and don't tell them how to use it, are they going to use the drill and pound the screw into the wood, or are they going to be able to drive the screw in a more efficient manner? So it takes some training and education.
Yeah, no, I think that's an interesting part. And I think, I've never heard anybody kind of talk about it from that perspective. It's like, you can have all these great insights and you can lay all these great plans, but if you're not kind of following up on that back end of like, hey, here's how it's intended to be used, or what the thought process or whatever, the vision was or whatever, it kind of all will fall apart eventually.
Absolutely. Your original question talked about something that's the bane of our existence, right? You go into a programming meeting and someone says, I need a classroom with 30 people, and the marker board goes here, and the technology goes here, and I sit here, right? And how do you get to the real solution? And one of the things during that design thinking process, that empathy phase, is actually going into those classrooms or those instructional spaces that they are using and teaching in, and watching. And just learning from how they do things. And so that how is really important. And so bringing to them ways to improve how they do those things is way more received than just us trying to make something up and draw it on a piece of paper for them. It's like, no, we've seen what you're doing. Here's the kind of things that we think that can go towards making your life easier, the student's life easier and better. No, I think that makes sense, because I think, you're talking about the survey, and and that's what I usually tell people. If I'm like, surveys are great, but if you don't compare that with the observation element, like, for example, you're talking about natural light. I remember being on a phone conversation with somebody like, oh man, we need a bunch of big tables. The kids like the big tables. Oh, really? Great. What do they like about the big tables? Well, I like to sit there and hang out. Awesome. Well, do you know like why they like to hang out there? Well, they've got, there's good light and whatever. I'm like, oh, really? So where are the big tables? Oh, they're right by the windows. I'm like, or do they like sitting by the window? And they're willing to accept this big table that they actually really hate. Right.
Because it's by the window, but like that, without that observational component, if you're just throwing a survey like, oh, I like the big tables in the library. I'm like, well, then now you're going to have seas of big tables everywhere. And we kind of all know how that plays out. So it's like, it's that observational component that goes in there as well is really critical.
Well, that's a perfect example for prototyping. Move the tables and put some comfy furniture by the windows and see if they sit there.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I think, well, I'm glad you brought that up too, because I think that's where people like, well, how am I going to prototype? I mean, it's this huge hill. And again, if you've never done it before, it seems very overwhelming, but it's like, well, you don't have to buy new furniture, move the furniture around. Call furniture manufacturers. You tell them, hey, I'm going to redo my space. Can I borrow some stuff? They'll be like, yeah, as one, like, we'll send you some stuff. Sure. And I think that's something that people, I think it can be overwhelming because it's a lot of work. And I think people, as I've noticed in projects, like people are always pressed for time. And I think when that starts to play up, it's like, no, we'll just, it'll be fine. We'll figure it out or whatever. And I think they kind of overlook that. And it's probably not that insurmountable to do. There's a lot of opportunities that people can take advantage of.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. Well, just going on the project track. So I really appreciate the insights on Richland. That makes a ton of sense. Are there any other projects that maybe stick out in your mind, maybe that highlight kind of the trends of either flexibility or the need to meet a diverse space or offering services, kind of some of the highlight points we just touched on here?
Well, I think one of the trends that goes along with the building types that we are working on is active learning, hands-on, whether it be the healthcare sort of nursing labs that we seem to be getting calls from everybody, to I've got a virtual reality lab that we've created, to physics and science rooms, psychology department, again, where where they're setting up observation rooms and they've got testing equipment so they could bring it, a lot of stuff for these kids to get hands-on learning that's really, really cool. The virtual reality lab, I got to wear the headset where they're dissecting a person, not just some, the teacher would say, typically we would use some sort of animal brain or something like this, but instead they've got a virtual reality set where they're actually working on a human brain. And it blows my mind. And so again, that flexibility, the technology infused spaces, again, are allowing them to use their spaces in much different ways. And so that's happening at Illinois College at Crispin Hall. You have some examples that
at Illinois Wesleyan University, they're working on a new building, a living learning community for entrepreneurship. It's been designed, fortunately or unfortunately for them. The location was to eliminate a former residence hall and rebuild a space there with maker spaces on the first floor for entrepreneurship and meeting and pitch type spaces, as well as residential above. Well, their enrollment bumped up so much last year that they couldn't afford to go without the existing residence hall. So it got put on hold until they can solve that problem in a temporary fashion, which is a good problem to have, but a little disappointing that the building project didn't get to start that we had worked so hard on. But it's phenomenal. It's got labs for AV type labs and shop type labs and 3D printing labs, and all the spaces where somebody who wants to take an idea from inside their brain to a physical object can do that at that space and then present it to potential people providing capital, venture capitalists, for instance, and see if they can move it forward and actually create something real out of it as part of their college experience.
Lincoln University, Center for Theater and Dance, obviously a theater-focused program. But in every project I can think of that I've worked on recently in the last few years is lab central. In terms of, we have a costume shop lab, we have a sound studio lab, we have a lighting studio lab, plus obviously your acting studios and your dance studios, again, where people are actively learning the trade instead of just learning it from books. There's actually a drafting lab in there too for set design. Working at Augustana College for Bergendorf Hall, which is a music building. And of course, there's rehearsal spaces, there's performance spaces, again, where people are actively utilizing their craft as a part of their learning. There's a classroom focus as well, but there's also the active learning that goes on as well. So it's every project I can think of right now has some sort of lab component associated with it, so that people are performance learning, active learning.
Yeah, interesting. Well, this has been really insightful today, guys. Just as we wrap up, I like to put everybody on the spot a little bit and just to get some words of encouragement for the audience.
Words of encouragement.
I think being open to new ideas, being flexible, being able to accept change, right? So and that goes for all of us everywhere, right? Being able to accept change. But in the education world, between the pandemic and now students coming back and what the students are wanting to learn, it's a continuous evolution. So you have to be willing to not just ask for what you know, but be able to explore some things that you don't know, to see how it can be done better or how you can do it in the future.
I just think the work out there is exciting. I think the challenges are great.
Mhm.
And so I always say this: if anybody could do it, So, but so the point is that they're hiring us to really establish some really great ideas that they can then support their programs.
Yeah.
The building is a tool. I think of the building as a tool. The building is no longer just an environment where things happen.
Mhm.
It's a tool to be used to help the function of that facility, whether it be through education, through active learning, whatever's going on, that building has to be a tool. And so I just think that the opportunities are exciting. I look forward to seeing what other people come up with. I mean, obviously we're always learning, but I look forward to being able to present our passions to universities and staff and students about what could actually be, because so often we talk to people that really feel like, well, there's just no better way. And that's not the truth. There's ways that we can get to the right answers that can help you be successful and grow. And I just think that's exciting.
Yeah. Sounds exciting. Well, I appreciate the time today, guys. This was great.
Awesome.
Thank you,
We
Joe.
appreciate the opportunity.
All right.
And I like the fact that we both have brick backgrounds.
Yeah, there you go.
Very architectural there.
All right. Thanks a lot.
All right.
All right. Thanks, Joe.